How to get the best video out of your A7C. I realize that best video is a rather subjective statement with a ton of variables, but I think it's worth simplifying for the scope of this video. To give ourselves some context and constraints though, I want to focus on who I imagine would be using the A7C. I can see a lot of vloggers or YouTubers whose main profession is not videography using this camera. I can also see a lot of budding videographers or people newer to the video space. Finally, I can see people like me who picked this up for casual personal use but appreciate the value of a log profile and getting the best image possible. The common thread between these users, I would imagine, is a focus on capturing content that looks good but doesn't require a ton of time in post-production to fine-tune the final image. These users may have heard things about shooting in a log profile, dynamic range, 8-bit, 10-bit, RAW. If they've heard of these things, they most likely associate them with achieving a professional image and getting a good image. I'd like to bring up, however, that professionals are more likely to prioritize capturing an image with maximum flexibility in post-production. They want to be able to capture a consistent image with a ton of information that is not affected by the many variables that come up from letting the camera make the decision. This is why things like autofocus, IBIS, or noise reduction are of lesser value to most professionals, while the ability to shoot in RAW or a robust codec is of more importance. For the users of this camera, however, I think the majority would prefer convenience over flexibility. So in order to achieve this, I'd like to make two suggestions or recommendations today. These are going to be two picture profiles and things to keep in mind when using them. Please keep in mind that these are not rules or claims that this is the absolute best despite the YouTube-friendly title. These are suggestions based on my personal findings and experience using this camera. Any of the profiles I'm not mentioning today is because I'm not familiar with them or because I found that it took too much work in post-production to make it look the way I wanted. So beginning with setup, the first profile is the standard profile that is enabled out of the box. If you immediately begin shooting with this profile on, you'll notice that your images have a distinct quote-unquote video look, which essentially means that there's just a lot of contrast and colors in your image at the expense of details, so to speak. It will lack a certain softness that one might associate with a more filmic look. This is caused by decisions the camera makes and can mostly be attributed to the sharpening and contrast the camera adds to your image. If you like this image, then by all means use it and close this video. If you're like me and you want something a little bit more subdued, then let's customize this image just a bit. So to begin, we're going to press the FN or function button on the back of the camera, navigate down to creative style. When we select it, we see standard pop up, so click right and you'll see that contrast is highlighted. We're going to drop that to -3, which is the lowest it will go. Next, we're going to go to saturation and bump that up by 2. Finally, sharpness, bump that down to -5. Sometimes I make sharpness -2. I haven't quite made up my mind on where I want this to be. I feel like -5 is good for skin tones and -2 is good for outdoors. Feel free to mess around with saturation and sharpness to see what works best for you. I do feel though that contrast should be at -3 to prevent too much loss of dynamic range. The second profile will be the infamous S-Log2. Since this is a log profile, the video will look very flat when you import it into your editing program. The opposite of standard, this profile captures far less contrast, saturation, and sharpness. The mindset behind this being that it gives you more flexibility in post-production. Now, a common problem when shooting S-Log2 with Sony's 8-bit codec is the lack of color information. This leads to strange things happening when you try to introduce color back into your image. To combat this, we're going to raise the saturation as far as it will go. A YouTuber named Denna Did It made a more in-depth video on this, so I'll link to that below. Anyways, to do this, press function again, navigate to PP off in the bottom left corner. Go down to PP7 and click right. Go down to saturation and increase it to +32. We're going to make one more change. Select color mode and choose sgamut3.cine. I find that this color mode adds a bit of magenta to your skin tones, which I personally find pleasing. There's a ton of information that can be covered when it comes to proper exposure, especially when using S-Log2. For brevity, I'm going to simplify things as much as I can, but if you have the time, I'd highly recommend spending some time researching it further at some point in the future. I'm going to recommend exposing via zebras. To enable this setting, go to page 7 on the second shooting tab in the menu and select zebra setting. Make sure zebra display is set to on and go down to zebra level. Go down to custom 1 and make sure the type is standard plus range. Set the standard to 70 and the range to ±1. Next, go down to custom 2, set the type to lower limit and the value to 98. I'd highly recommend assigning zebras to a custom key. You can access this setting on page 9 of the second shooting tab. Select the second custom key option with the movie icon. I've set mine to the C button. Now when you're shooting in your modified standard profile, have custom 2 in your zebra selected, make your image brighter until you see the zebra pattern over the brightest part of your image, then dial it back one step so the zebras disappear. This will give you a really good image right away. When you want to shoot yourself or people, however, I'd recommend switching to custom 1 and doing the same process but with your skin. That is, expose until you see zebras on your face, then dial it back until they mostly disappear. When shooting in S-Log2, we're going to change our custom 2 setting to 107 and repeat the same exposure process. In short, this gives us cleaner shadows in our image and we get more information to work with. When we shoot people, we'll switch over to custom 1 and expose exactly the same way. As a quick side note, you can use your custom 2 setting of 107 or even 108 with a standard profile and bring down the highlights and whites in post-production. But I noticed that this introduced a color shift, at least in the blues, which I personally don't like. I find that 98 is a reasonably conservative level that gets great results right out of camera. So a quick little section on post-production. Whatever editing program you're using, try to find a waveform monitor because we're going to use that to fine-tune our image. And whether it be standard or S-Log2, we're going to make basic adjustments to bring down the shadows in our image to about 5 IRE and the highlights to around 80 to 85. Again, this is personal preference, but to me this gives a nice even look that can be achieved very quickly. Now, I think it's worth asking ourselves whether shooting in S-Log2 is better or worth it. Since it's such a flat profile, our starting point with S-Log2 already has very bright shadows. We'll still lower the shadows, but that just means that if we want to retain more information in the shadows and need brighter shadows, we don't have to lift them in post-production like we might have to do if we shoot in standard mode. So because the majority of scenes are actually okay and not extremely high contrast, I think shooting in a standard profile will actually save you a lot of time. Of course, when it comes to extremely high contrast scenes, I think S-Log2 is a no-brainer because of the extra shadow details. Again, because S-Log2 is so flat, it's more likely that you'll have to lower your shadows than raise your shadows in order to keep that detail. As long as your highlights aren't clipping, then you have much more room to work with in terms of dynamic range. I will say though that S-Log2 across the board produces oranges and yellows that come out very green. This is something I noticed with HLG as well, except HLG seems to be a lot worse with this. With skin tones, it's hard to gauge since ISO values are different between the two profiles and how I expose them, but standard seems a bit more consistent. I've found that S-Log2 skin tones are either too magenta or too green depending on the ISO. On the other hand, I feel like skin comes out a lot softer with S-Log2, but this could be because sharpness can be turned down to -7 on S-Log2, whereas -5 is the maximum on standard. Long story short, of course, there are a ton of variables, but I feel like the colors coming out of the standard profile are actually going to be better for a lot of people and easier to work with. So for A7C users who want to get a nice image straight out of camera, I'd highly recommend a modified standard profile. The way it renders colors seems very natural and pleasing, and you don't lose out much on dynamic range because we're not always shooting high contrast scenes. It'll save you tons of time in the long run. If you do find yourself needing more dynamic range or want a softer image, or if you want to become more familiar with a log profile, then I'd go for S-Log2. I'm actually surprised at how much I like the S-Log2 video coming out of the A7C, especially after using 12-bit RAW on my Pocket 4K. But after all this testing, I think I'll actually begin to shoot most things in the standard profile, because again, it just gets me to the final image in my head just a little bit faster than shooting in S-Log2. I don't think in my personal use case that I'm losing much, or if anything, by shooting standard. Finally, I also think it's worth asking ourselves what we really need out of a camera. What good is chasing the best codec with the most flexibility if we're not going to take advantage of it? Are we just trying to shoot in log profiles or 10-bit or whatever because the pros or professionals said that they were good? Of course, they need it for their workflows and their projects, but for the standard user or me, we don't really need those options, do we? Are we chasing that just because other people are chasing that, or that's the industry standard and whatnot and blah, 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 when we actually don't really need it? I feel like these are questions that we should ask ourselves. Anyways, hopefully this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. I realize that I may have glossed over things or oversimplified things just for the sake of brevity. But anyways, hope this helped. Be healthy. Bye. Oh my god, what is wrong with my nose? Holy shit.